Welcome back to a policy brief. I am your host, Eromosele, and today on this episode of Policy Pulse, we are reviewing the headlines for the week that we believe are most significant, especially in terms of public policy. And these are issues that we believe are currently defining American governance right now. And I'll say, let's just put a pause on the noise. There's a lot of noise and debate on the issues that we're going to be covering. Would say that these are decisions on things like taxes, trade, the US debt, immigration, and even AI. And these are topics that will fundamentally reshape your future and America's place in the world for the decades to come. And I would say get ready because what's happening, I believe, in Washington and the policies that are currently being talked about and receiving new guidance will affect your wallet. It would also affect your job and your daily life, which is sort of what policy does. It shapes. So to our first topic of the segment would be the fiscal policy trifecta. That's what I choose to call it, because we're looking at tax cuts, we're also looking at tariffs, and we're also looking at US debt. Now, the fiscal policy trifecta that we're going to be looking at is what has been dominating the policy space in the US for a while, and then last, I believe, couple of months since the president took over. And, we're looking at tax cuts, tariffs, and what some would, characterize as a looming debt crisis. And I would say we are witnessing the largest fiscal experiment in the US in decades. And for me, what I think will be my first policy question is Republicans currently control Congress and the White House. And, you sort of see there's a push for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And my question would be, given that, they sort of have control over the House and, Congress, why is there such an intense political battle over what some would term conservative priorities, right? Being things like tax cuts and the likes. So it's a 4.5 trillion tax extension through the budget, reconciliation. Yes, you heard that right, 4.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. And just quickly run through, the ongoing process, with the Senate and the House. Just quick, projection of what we're likely to see. Long run GDP is expected to increase by 1.2%, GNP by 0.9%, capital stock by 0.7%. But then you also see like tax revenue, I believe up to 2034 is going to decrease by $5 trillion. And that's quite significant to point out. Obviously, these are estimates, right? So these are things that I think are at the forefront of, this particular bill, apart from the fact that it does increase the US debt ceiling in the end. But it's quite important that, we talk about this because I believe in 2011, US saw the Standard & Poor's, that's the rating agency, downgrade the US from, I believe, AAA to AAA plus, I believe. And then, in 2023, I believe it was Fitch. They also downgraded the US because of, their current, debt level and the debt trajectory. From, I believe, I think they downgraded the US to AA, or was it AA plus? And basically it was downgraded. And there was concern, obviously, in terms of like the US fiscal capacity. And, for me, like when I was just going through this particular topic was shocking to me was that the US spent more on interest, paying back their debt than they spent on defense, I believe, last year. And, that's something that's quite worrisome. You then, see this ongoing, communication with the president, trying to get the Fed to lower rates, which obviously from a policy perspective, can't see how that affects central bank independence. But you can see the push, to sort of fix the debt problem that the US has. And I think that's why this is important, apart from, other things that, people tend to look at, like, tax and tips and the likes. So this is from the Tax Foundation, and I really like the good work that they do. I think it's something that you can check out. Now, here's where it gets really interesting because the numbers are staggering. According to, the patent budget model, They say that many trade models fail to capture the full harm of the tariffs. And they believe, and this is April 8, 2025, it will reduce the long run GDP by about 6% and wages by about 5%. And a middle income household would face a $22,000 lifetime loss. These losses are twice as large as a revenue equivalent corporate tax increase from 21% to 36%. And that's quite interesting to note. For me, I'd say like the policy question that we need to consider is, can tariff revenue realistically offset the cost of massive tax cuts that we're thinking about in light of the tariff situation that we're going to have with the tax bill if it gets passed, and with the tariffs that we have already? So can revenue realistically offset what we're going to get from the tax cuts, or is this sort of an unsustainable fiscal equation that we're going to have at the end of the day? Considering the debt ceiling, wildcard that, roller coaster that we've seen, is it something that's just theoretical? Because we did hit the 36 trillion, dollar debt ceiling, I believe, in January, and we sort of had like Treasury Secretary Yellen coming with some extraordinary measures, and fast forward to today, and we're seeing that this big beautiful bill is going to sort of raise that debt ceiling by about $5 trillion. And while that doesn't quite stops the problem, sort of kicks the can down the road, and that's something that I believe we have to come to terms with, because it doesn't quite help the fiscal position of the US. And I get there's a lot of talk about Doge and other policies that are coming in play to sort of cut that deficit and sort of help the US in terms of how it sorts out its interest and that it pays for its debt. I'd say it's a bit of a tightrope that the US is in, from a fiscal standpoint. Also, you have to also consider that the conference board estimates that we could reach, the date where the US sort of has to confront the fact that it might default on its debt somewhere around between June and September 2025, which is why I can understand the haste to sort of get this big beautiful bill passed to increase the debt ceiling. And sort of think about the irony, because there's a tax cut of $4.5 trillion that we're trying to see get passed. At the same time, we're raising the debt ceiling by about $5 trillion. And so that's something that sort of have to come to terms with, because if you sort of look at the graph between 1985 and where we are 2025, we can see like the debt being 36.1 trillion in 2025, and sometime in 1985 being about 1.8 trillion. So you can see like the increase in debt, and it's quite important that this is something that gets sorted really quick. Our next topic on the show will be immigration and its effect on the economy, and I'll just tag it as the immigration and economic security effect. So talking about immigration now, it's not just about border security anymore, which we've seen the policy shifts in that regard in terms of border security, which I believe was important for the US. We're now, considering how that's going to be reshaping the labor market, and considering the backdrop of the national budget that we just recently talked about in terms of, the borrowing costs that the US has to face, and, increasing the debt ceiling and the likes. So when you consider the effect of that, how does that affect the economy? We've seen that the administration has deported over 100,000 individuals in a few months in 2025. We're in middle of the year right now. So they've deported over 100,000 people, and ICE, is expanding its authority nationwide. And so the projection, we're going to see more people get deported. But here's the economic angle that I believe a lot of analysts are not quite shining a lot of light on, is that their plans to double detention capacity to 100,000 individuals. I believe it represents a significant increase in infrastructure and budgetary commitment, irrespective of the pros and the cons of doing that. we sort of have to consider we're going to see billions spent in terms of construction and operational costs at a time when the fiscal resources are already strained. And that's the angle that I'm looking at this from. So the question then now confronts me. How do we balance the fiscal cost of expanding or expanded immigration enforcement with other budgetary priorities, for instance, with things that we talked about like tax cuts and infrastructure. And you also have to consider the ripple effects going forward between, I believe, let's say 700,000 immigrants facing the possibility of losing protected status, designations are repealed. Then you now have to consider, the ripple effects on industries like agriculture, construction, and healthcare. And these industries are heavily reliant on immigrant labor. So one then now considers, this isn't now a humanitarian issue. It's a potential workforce shock, of which the US is one of the most resilient economies. You sort of have to give them that. But, from a policy perspective, you have to consider these issues. Would we, see slowdown in economic growth? Could these drive costs, up? And will this lead to like labor shortages in critical sectors? And I think these are policy questions that we should consider and think about. And then we weigh the trade-offs. So our next topic will be on healthcare policy. For me, healthcare is quite important. So this topic, sort of got me inspired and fired up. You sort of have to also consider that there are pressures here, with this particular, bill, because it cuts across the board. And you then, see that healthcare policy is where fiscal pressure meets what I would term social promise, because you sort of have a social contract with the state. And, the tension, is at an all-time high. It's escalating, and that's sort of how I see it. And the reconciliation bill, being debated and, scaling, in different parts of the House includes potential Medicaid cuts, what hundreds of billions over 10 years. And these cuts are designed to pay for those, massive tax cuts that we just discussed. We also see that the Congressional Budget Office analysis is quite sobering in the sense that earlier versions of similar legislation would strip health coverage for nearly 9 million people with Medicaid and ACA plans. We also see that the final House bill includes last-minute revisions that could deepen these coverage losses. And one then has to ask the question, because when I see the things like this, policy issues, I always like to look, what's the policy question here? And, what are the alternatives? What are the trade-offs? And for me, the policy question here is this politically sustainable? Policy and politics sort of go hand in hand. Is it politically sustainable to cut healthcare coverage for millions of people while providing, tax benefits that disproportionately favor higher income households? Because, if you go through this particular article, from Medicaid rights, you see that it claims like, obviously you have to do the work and go through the bill. But they claim that, this particular bill sort of favors the tax cut disproportionately benefits high income earners. And it also talks about how people who are, the seniors are, affected, and certain other groups. And so that's sort of what you have to also consider, because, these demographics or these people are still, participants in the political process. So yes, that's something we have to also consider. And also, it appears that Medicaid faces what I would consider a double threat. Not only, are direct cuts being proposed, but if the reconciliation bill increases the deficits as projected, we then now see mandatory sequestration cuts would reduce Medicaid funding, by approximately 500 billion over, I believe 2026 to 2034. And, while that does look serious, we also have to consider that, Social Security does offer a little bit of respite, with about, I believe, 2.5% cost of living adjustment. It's a modest increase, but it pales in comparison to the healthcare cost, that will bring a lot of pressure to certain groups like seniors and people who aren't quite well off, economically. And this really isn't all about the numbers. It's about access to healthcare for millions of Americans. And from a policy standpoint, I believe that that's something to keep an eye on. Our next topic would be technology governance. Now, President Trump's administration has fundamentally reversed America's approach to artificial intelligence, where the Biden administration emphasized things like safety and risk mitigation. The new framework by President Trump prioritizes removing barriers to American leadership. This, for me, isn't just a regulatory philosophy. It's a multi-billion-dollar economic strategy. And I think from a policy standpoint, looking at national security and the future of the world in terms of AI, I think it's the, right way to go. I also think, sort of like how tech companies sort of start, they move fast, they make a lot of mistakes, and then regulation sort of comes. You sort of have to weigh the pros and the cons. But from a national security standpoint for the US, one can argue that that's sort of the right approach. You sort of want leadership, and you don't want to, get caught holding the bag. That being said, for me, AI policy pivot, I think, is something worth mentioning. Sort of seem like a topic that you just sort of, didn't really make all the headlines. But I think, it's something that, one needs to sort of look at and, ask, questions that I think are important. The administration, that's this current administration has directed federal agencies to prioritize AI systems developed and produced in the United States in procurement decisions. And, for me, this represents billions in potential market advantages for American AI companies. When you think about American first, I think that's sort of also in line with that. Now, but for me, the policy question here is, can the US, maintain AI leadership through deregulation alone? Or, do we need to see a coordinated public investment to compete with, China's state-directed approach? And, there's little, topic that sort of, is related that, I saw, not too long ago, and, had to do with, cybersecurity. There's a new executive order that reveals interesting priorities, while also maintaining, core protections. It specifically focuses on, foreign cyber threat actors, rather than broader, risk. And for me, the other emphasizes securing third-party software supply chains and preparing for post-quantum cryptography threats. And I think, it's important, at this point to recognize that it's a strategic rebalancing aiming to protect critical infrastructure from specific geopolitical threats. And I think it's a step in the right direction, but I'm also sort of, considering from a policy standpoint what implementation would look like. I think that's where I'll leave that on, but I will track that, and hopefully we might end up doing a deep dive on that, because I'm quite interested in cybersecurity, so I think I might do a deep dive. Our next topic would be on climate and energy strategic shift. The present administration has declared a national energy emergency to just justify the sweeping policy changes that we've seen since, inauguration. And this includes things like offshore drilling, expansions in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Arctic regions. And we also have relaxed methane emission regulations and potential elimination of the Inflation Reduction Act, renewable energy credits. This is some would say direct challenge to climate goals. And, when I saw this, I was just sort of thinking about, on the one hand, you have, energy dominance. On the other hand, you sort of have achieving climate goals. Now, while I was, sort of doing my research on this particular topic, when I saw it, I came across the University of Maryland analysis. And, it projects significant impact, under the full federal rollback scenarios. They project that renewable energy electricity share would drop by from 51% to 46% by 2035, with methane emissions increasing 5% relative to 2020 levels instead of the 15% reduction under current policies. And, I just like to quickly go over, what's here in this. So this is document, but I also like to quickly go over some of the findings. They say federal clean energy policy rollbacks in the United States will lead to substantial economic and healthcare damages across the country, with some severe states and local impact, resulting in a $206 increase in average home energy cost in 2035, as well as an additional 22,800 deaths of Americans, and a $1.1 trillion reduction in US GDP, and $160 billion income loss cumulative over the next decade. For me, this is quite significant, and it says these rollbacks will also limit the rate of reduction of economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions. And the other things, that you can see, some states are more affected than others. I could go on, but I think it's something you can go and check. Texas, Florida, Virginia, Maryland, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, Michigan. So I think this is worthy of given a read. And for me, the policy question, when I was going through that document, is what are the long-term economic costs of reversing clean energy investments, particularly given the global shift towards renewable technologies? And I think that's something that we sort of have to consider. What are the trade-offs, and how does this play out? This, brilliant, analysis done by them. I took my time going through, the work that they did, and I think it's something that we have to sort of consider on the topic of full rollback, from achieving climate goals to one where we now have energy dominance in the US. So our next topic would be looking at democratic governance and its challenges. Now, while federal attention, seems to focus more on economic issues, we're seeing that state governments are creating an increasing complex privacy regulatory landscape. Now we have 8 new state privacy laws that will take effect in 2025, bringing the total to 16 comprehensive state privacy laws by the end of the year. This creates significant compliance challenges for businesses operating across state lines, particularly as states like Maryland have implemented or will implement stricter data minimization provisions compared to other jurisdictions. The policy question for me when I was, considering, the change in privacy laws, you have to also consider, should, federal policymakers intervene to create a uniform privacy standard, or is state level intervention or innovation rather the better approach? And that's something one has to sort of consider and look at the background, look at context and the data that sort of goes with that, and consider the policy alternatives. So for me, that's something that I thought would be a good question to ask. And then finally, considering the challenges in the democratic governance, we now move on to voting rights. We've seen multiple legal challenges targeting Voting Rights Act provision. For instance, while I believe 159 municipalities in New Jersey alone have challenged affordable housing obligations, you then find separate issues reflected in the tension that we see. And how I summarize this, so that there's a lot of debate as to whether should federal government set standards for voting rights, or should states take the lead on that. And so for me, these two things, voting rights and privacy laws, for me they sort of come under the umbrella of the challenges that face in democratic governance. So do we have the federal government taking point in terms of providing a standard for voting rights, or do we have states leading that? And I think that's something that one needs to consider. What we are seeing isn't 6 different topics. It's an interconnected web of fiscal, economic, and governance challenges that will ultimately define America's trajectory for decades. And surprisingly, the math is stark. With massive tax cuts, plus aggressive tariffs, plus debt ceiling constraints, plus healthcare cuts, you have a fiscal equation that may not add up. Also, the OECD recently has downgraded the US GDP growth projections from 2.2% to 1.6% for 2025, citing trade disruptions from tariff policies. And, for me, when I see that, the backdrop for me is, are we witnessing a sustainable policy realignment, or are we witnessing contradictions that are setting us up for future crisis? And then you also have to ask the question, the political, which I would say is like the political sustainability question. Can a governing majority maintain public support while simultaneously cutting healthcare coverage, raising consumer costs through tariffs, constraining fiscal flexibility through massive tax cuts for higher income households? You consider that the narrow Republican majorities in both chambers, therefore, they make every vote crucial, and House, Freedom Caucus members want, I believe, deeper spending cuts, while you also see the others in the divide seeking for tax relief for higher tax states. These competing pressures could derail the entire legislative agenda, leading to gridlock or even government shutdowns. But I believe, having sort of how aggressive they've been to push this big beautiful, I believe it's going to get passed. What happens remains to be seen. Also, I also believe that we are at a critical juncture in American policymaking, and the decisions made in the next weeks to a few months on issues like tax reform, the debt ceiling, spending priorities will echo throughout the next decade. And my role really as a policy analyst here right now is isn't to predict winners or losers, and the like, but to sort of help provide an understanding, of the trade-off and consequences that come from these policy issues. And what we're seeing really is unprecedented in its scope and ambition, but it also, I believe, provides contradictions and risks that one has to take account for. Now, given these interconnected challenges, another question I would like to leave us with is, what should citizens and policymakers prioritize to ensure sustainability and effective governance? And that's today's policy brief. What do you think is the most critical issue that we covered? Drop your analysis in the comments section below and let us know which topic you like us to do a deep dive on next week. And don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell. With policy changes happening rapidly, you need to stay informed and to stay ahead. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week for another deep dive into the issues that have happened over the week.